It says live, it says, and evidently, because you're not seeing it, so evidently it's not. I'll be darned, and it's telling me I'm live. 12 seconds into live. Tap friend, share to group. Oh, for heaven, I don't understand. Darling, thank you. I do not understand it. I don't do a thing, and suddenly it's on. All right. Thank you, Bob Diamond. This is becoming a routine. Every week, it's Bob, and we're talking, and suddenly I'm live again. All right. I'll get on with it. Thank you, darling. Bye now. I do not understand it at all. I do everything I'm supposed to do in it. Jason, if you're watching, I need to hire you. That's all there is to it. Enough of this. Okay, here we are. I'll start all over again. My dears. Whew. When we, for whatever reason, are far from the country we were born and grew up in, we tend to cling to the things of home. I grew up in a small town, it was then a small town, of less than 7,000 people, Hampton, Virginia, the oldest continuous English-speaking settlement in the United States. And there were several elderly people in town who said, instead of cards and garden, said gyards and gyarden. Our minister was Carter Henry Harrison. Kyarta, I wish to talk to you. And I thought, what is this? Well, many years later, I discovered that was a brief speech affectation in the court of Queen Anne. So shortly after 1700, the colonists who came here brought it with them, not knowing that it ceased to be in England, but they kept it because it was home. And 3 centuries later, you can still hear it. So, on with the short story for tonight. The Trawnbeighs by Charles M. Flandrau. When my first New Year's party dispersed, I walked back to the center of the town with a man who had lived for many years in Mexico, who had been everywhere and done everything, and who seemed to know something funny or tragic or scandalous about everybody in the world. He loved to talk, to describe, to recall. And while we had some drinks together at a cafe under the sky blue portales, he aroused my interest in people I had never heard of and never should see. He told me, among other things, about the Trawnbeighs. The Trawnbeighs, he said, were the sort of people who dressed for dinner, even when, as sometimes happened, they had no dinner in the house to dress for. It is perhaps unnecessary to add that the Trawnbeighs were English. Indeed, on looking back, I often feel that to that apparently flippant statement, it is unnecessary to add anything. For to one who knew Mr. and Mrs. Trawnbeighs, Edwina, Violet, Maud, and Cyril, it was the first and last word on them, their alpha and omega, together with all that went between. Not that the statement is flippant, far from it. There is in it a seriousness, a profundity, an immense philosophic import. At times it has almost moved me to lift my hat, very much as one does for reasons of state, or religion, or death. This, let me hasten to explain, is not at all the way I feel when I put on evening clothes myself, which I do at least twice out of my every 365 opportunities. No born American could feel that way about his own dress coat. He sometimes thinks he does. He often pretends he does, but he really doesn't. As a matter of unimportant fact, the born American may have dressed every evening of his grown-up life, but if he found himself on an isolated, played-out Mexican coffee and vanilla finca with a wife, 4 children, a tiled roof that leaked whenever there was a norther, an unsealed sala, through the bamboo partitions of which a cold, wet wind howled, sometimes for a week at a time, with no money, no capacity for making any, no prospects, and no cook. Under these depressing circumstances, it is impossible to conceive of an American dressing for dinner every night at 7:15 in any spirit but one of ghastly humor. With the Trawnbeighs' performance of this sacred rite, however, irony and humor had nothing to do. The Trawnbeighs had a robust sense of fun. So, I feel sure, have pumpkins and turnips and the larger varieties of the nutritious potato family. But humor, when they didn't recognize it, bewildered them, and it always struck them as just a trifle underbred when they did. Trawnbeighs had come over to Mexico, come out from England, he would have expressed it, as a kind of secretary to his cousin, Sir Somebody Something, who was building a harbor or a railway or a canal. I don't believe Trawnbeighs himself ever knew just what it was, for a British company down in the hot country. Mrs. Trawnbeighs, with her young, was to follow on the next steamer a month later, and she was in mid-ocean when Sir Somebody suddenly died of yellow fever. She did not learn of this inopportune event until it was too late to turn back. Still, I doubt whether she would have turned back if she could. For as Trawnbeighs once explained to me, at a time when they literally hadn't enough to eat, a hailstorm had not only destroyed his coffee crop, but had frozen the roots of most of his trees, and the price of vanilla had fallen from 10 cents a bean to 3.5. Leaving England at all, he explained, had necessitated burning their bridges behind them. He did not tell me the nature of their bridges, nor whether they had made much of a blaze. In fact, that one inflammatory allusion was the nearest approach to a personal confidence Trawnbeighs was ever known to make in all his 15 years of Mexican life. The situation when he met Mrs. Trawnbeighs and the children on the dock at Veracruz was extremely dreary, and at the end of a month it had grown much worse, although the Trawnbeighs apparently didn't think so. They even spoke and wrote as if their affairs were looking up a bit. For after a few weeks of visiting among kindly compatriots at Veracruz and Rebozo, Mrs. Trawnbeighs became cook for some English engineers. There were 7 of them. In a sizzling, mosquito-y, feverish mudhole on the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the Trawnbeighs didn't call it cook, neither did the 7 engineers. I don't believe the engineers even thought of it as cook. What Mrs. Trawnbeighs thought of it will never be known. How could they, when that lady, after feeding the 4 little Trawnbeighs, or rather the 4 young Trawnbeighs, they'd never been little, a meal I think they called the nursery tea, managed every afternoon, within the next 2 hours, first to create out of nothing a perfectly edible dinner for 9 persons, and secondly, to receive them all at 7:45 in a red-striped lemon satin ball gown, it looked like poisonous wallpaper, 11 silver bangles, a cameo necklace, and an ostrich tip sprouting from the top of her head. Trawnbeighs, too, was in evening clothes, and they didn't call it cooking. They spoke of it as looking after the mess, or keeping an eye on the young chaps' livers. Nevertheless, Mrs. Trawnbeighs, daughter of the late the Honourable Cyril Crosby Godolphin Dundas and the late Claire Walpurga Emmeline Moat, cooked and cooked hard for almost a year. At the end of which time she was stricken with what she was pleased to refer to as a bad go of fever. Fortunately, they were spared having to pass around the hat, although it would have amounted to that if Trawnbeighs hadn't, after the pleasant English fashion, come into some money. In the United States, people know to a cent what they may expect to inherit, and sometimes they then don't get it. But in England there seems to be an endless succession of retired and unmarried army officers who die every little while in Jermyn Street and have leave £2,000 to a distant relative they have never met. Something like this happened to Trawnbay, and on the prospect of his legacy, he was able to pull out of the Trawnbeighs mud hole and restore his wife to her usual state of health in the pure and bracing air of Rebozo. Various things can be done with £2,000, but just what shall be done ought to depend very largely on whether they happen to be one's first 2,000 or one's last. Trawnbay, however, invested interred would be a more accurate term, quite as if they never would be missed. The disposition to be a country gentleman was in Trawnbay's blood. Indeed, the first impression one received from the family was that everything they did was in their blood. It never seemed to me that Trawnbay had immediately sunk the whole of his little fortune in an old, small, and dilapidated coffee place, so much because he was dazzled by the glittering financial future the shameless owner, another Englishman, by the way, predicted for him, as because to own an estate and live on it was, so to speak, his natural element. He had tried, while Mrs. Trawnbay was cooking on the isthmus, to get something to do, but there was really nothing in Mexico he could do. He was splendidly strong, and in the United States he very cheerfully and with no loss of self-respect or point of view would have temporarily shoveled wheat or coal or driven a team or worked on the street force, as many another Englishman of noble lineage has done before and since. But in the tropics, an Anglo-Saxon cannot be a day laborer. He can't, because he can't. And there was in Mexico no clerical position open to Trawnbay because he did not know Spanish. It is significant that after 15 consecutive years of residence in the country, none of the Trawnbeighs knew Spanish. To be somehow and somewhere an English country gentleman of a well-known, slightly old-fashioned type was as much Trawnbeigh's destiny as it is the destiny of, say, a polar bear to be a polar bear, or a camel to be a camel. As soon as he got his £2,000, he became one. When I first met them all, he had been one for almost 10 years. I had recently settled in Trawnbeigh's neighborhood, which in Mexico means that my ranch was a hard day-and-a-half ride from his, over roads that are not roads, but merely ditches full of liquefied mud on the level stretches, and ditches full of assorted boulders on the ascent. So although we looked neighborly on a small map, I might not have had the joy of meeting the Trawnbeighs for years if my mule hadn't gone lame one day when I was making the interminable trip to Rebozo. Trawnbeigh's place was 7 miles from the main road, and as I happened to be near the parting of the ways when the off hind leg of Catalina began to limp, I decided to leave her with my mozo at an Indian village until a pack train should pass by. There is always someone in a pack train who can remove a bad shoe, while I proceeded on the mozo's mule to the Trawnbeighs. My usual stopping place for the night was 5 miles farther on, and the Indian village was, well, it was an Indian village. Time and again I had been told of Trawnbeigh's early adventures, and I felt sure he could put me up, as he would have said himself, for the night. He put me up, not only that night, but as my mozo didn't appear until late the next afternoon, a second night as well. And when I at last rode away, it was with the feeling of having learned from the Trawnbeighs a great lesson. In the first place, they couldn't have expected me. They couldn't possibly have expected anyone, and it was a hot afternoon. But as it was the hour at which people at home dropped in for tea, Mrs. Trawnbay and her 3 plain, heavy-looking daughters were perfectly prepared to dispense hospitality to any number of mythical friends. They had on hideous but distinctly dressy dresses of amazingly stamped materials known, I believe, as summer silks, and they were all four tightly laced. Current fashion in Paris, London, and New York by no means insisted on small, smooth, round waists, but the Trawnbeighs women had them because, as it gradually dawned on me, to have had any other kind would have been a concession to anatomy and the weather. Anything so compressible as one's anatomy, or so vulgarly impartial as the weather, the Trawnbeighs simply did not concede. I never could get over the feeling that they all secretly regarded weather in general as a kind of popular institution, of vital importance only to the middle class. Cyril, an extremely beautiful young person of 22, who had been playing tennis by himself on the Assoleadero, was in flannels, and Trawnbeighs admirably looked the part in grey, middle-aged riding things, although, as I discovered before leaving, their stable at the time consisted of one senile burro with ingrowing hoofs. From the first, it all seemed too flawless to be true. I had never visited in England, but I doubt if there is another country whose literature gives one so definite and lasting an impression of its home life. Perhaps this is because the life of families of the class to which the Trawnbeighs belonged proceeds in England by such a series of definite and traditional episodes. In a household like theirs, the unexpected must have a devil of a time in finding a chance to happen. For during my visit, absolutely nothing happened that I hadn't long since chuckled over in making the acquaintance of Jane Austen, Thackeray, George Eliot, and Anthony Trollope. They all of them did at every tick of the clock precisely what they ought to have done. They were a page the least bit crumpled, torn from half hours with the best authors, and cast, dear heaven, upon a hillside in darkest Mexico. Of course, we had tea in the garden. There wasn't any garden, but we nevertheless had tea in it. The house would have been cooler, less glaring, and free from the venomous little rhododoros that stung the backs of my hands full of microscopic polka dots. But we all strolled out to a spot some 50 yards away where a bench, half a dozen shaky homemade chairs, and a rustic table were most imperfectly shaded by 3 tattered banana trees. "We love to drink tea in the dingle-dangle," Mrs. Trawnbeighs explained. How the tea tray itself got to the dingle-dangle, I have only a general suspicion, for when we arrived it was already there, equipped with caddy, cozy, a plate of buttered toast, a pot of strawberry jam, and all the rest of it. But try as I might, I simply could not rid myself of the feeling that at least 2 footmen had arranged it all and then discreetly retired. A feeling that also sought to account for the tray's subsequent removal, which took place while Trawnbeighs, Cyril, Edwina, and I walked over to inspect the Assoleadero and washing tanks. I wanted to look back, but something, the fear perhaps of being turned into a pillar of salt, restrained me. With most English-speaking persons in that part of the world, conversation has to do with coffee, coffee, and coffee. The Trawnbeighs, however, scarcely touched on the insistent topic. While we sat on the low wall of the dilapidated little Assoleadero, we discussed pheasant shooting and the best places for haberdashery and Gladstone bags. Cyril, as if it were but a matter of inclination, said he thought he might go over for the shooting that year. A cousin had asked him to make a 7th. I never found out what this meant and didn't have the nerve to ask. "Bertie shoots the 12th, doesn't he?" Edwina here inquired. To which her brother replied, as if she had shown a distressing ignorance of some fundamental date in history, like 1066 or 1215, "Bertie always shoots the 12th. The best place for haberdashery, in Mr. Trawnbeighs' opinion, was the stores. But Cyril preferred a small shop in Bond Street, maintaining firmly, but with good humour, that it was not merely, as the pater insisted, because the fellow charged more, but because one didn't run the risk of seeing some beastly bounder in a cravat uncommonly like one's own. Trawnbeighs, as a sedate parent bordering on middle age, felt obliged to stand up for the more economical stores, but it was evident that he really admired Cyril's exclusive principles and approved of them. Edwina cut short the argument with an abrupt question. "I say," she inquired anxiously, "has the dressing bell gone yet?" The dressing bell hadn't gone, but it soon went, for Mr. Trawnbeighs, after looking at his watch, bustled off to the house and rang it himself. Then we withdrew to our respective apartments to dress for dinner. "I've put you in the north wing, old man. There's always a breeze in the wing," my host declared, as he ushered me into a bamboo shed they used apparently for storing corn and iron implements of an agricultural nature. But there was also in the room a recently made-up cot with real sheets, a tin bathtub, hot and cold water in 2 earthenware jugs, and an empty packing case upholstered in oilcloth. When Trawnbeighs spoke of this last as a wash-hand stand, I knew I had indeed strayed from life into the realms of mid-Victorian romance. The breeze Trawnbeighs had referred to developed in the violent Mexican way while I was enjoying the bathtub into an unmistakable norther. Water fell on the roof like so much lead and then sprang off, some of it did, in thick round streams from the tin spouts. The wind screamed in and out of the tiles overhead, and through the north wing's blurred windows, the writhing banana trees of the dingle-dangle looked like strange things one sees in an aquarium. As soon as I could get into my clothes again, a bath was as far as I was able to live up to the Trawnbeighs ideal, I went into the sala where the dinner table was already set with a really heart-rending attempt at splendor. I have said that nothing happened with which I had not a sort of literary acquaintance, but I was wrong. While I was standing there wondering how the Trawnbeighs had been able all those years to keep it up, a window in the next room blew open with a bang. I ran in to shut it, but before I reached it, I stopped short, and as hastily and quietly as I could, tiptoed back to the wing. For the next room was the kitchen, and at one end of it, Trawnbeighs, in a shabby but perfectly fitting dress coat, his trousers rolled up halfway to his knees, was patiently holding an umbrella over his wife's sacred dinner gown, while she, bebangled, becameoed, beplumed, and stripped to the buff, masterfully cooked our dinner on the brasero. To me, it was all extremely wonderful. And the wonder of it did not lessen during the 5 years in which, on my way to and from Rebozo, I stopped over at the Trawnbeighs several times a year. For although I knew that they were often financially all but down and out, the endless red tape of their daily life never struck me as being merely a pathetic bluff. Their rising bells and dressing bells, their apparent dependence on all sorts of pleasant accessories that simply did not exist, their occupations, I mean those on which I did not have to turn a tactful back, such as botanizing, crewel work, painting horrible watercolors, and composing long lists of British-sounding things to be sent out from the stores. The informality with which we waited on ourselves at luncheon, and the stately, punctilious manner in which we did precisely the same thing at dinner. the preordained hour at which Mrs. Trawnbey and the girls each took a candle and said good night, leaving Trawnbey, Cyril, and me to smoke a pipe and do a whiskey peg. Trawnbey had spent some years in India. The whole inflexibly insular scheme of their existence was infinitely more than a bluff. It was a placid, tenacious clinging to the straw of their ideal in a great, deep sea of poverty, discomfort, and isolation. And it had its reward. For after 14 years of Mexican life, Cyril was almost exactly what he would have been had he never seen the place. And Cyril was the Trawnbeys' one asset of immense value. He was most agreeable to look at. He was both related to and connected with many of the most historical-sounding ladies and gentlemen in England. And he had just the limited, selfish, amiable outlook on the world in general that was sure, granting the other things, to impress Miss Irene Slapp of Pittsburgh as the height of both breeding and distinction. Irene Slapp had beauty and distinction of her own. Somehow, although they all needed the money, I don't believe Cyril would have married her if she hadn't. Anyhow, one evening in the city of Mexico, he took her in to dinner at the British legation, where he had been asked to dine as a matter of course. And before the second entree, Miss Slapp was slightly in love with him, and very deeply in love with the scheme of life, the standard, the ideal, or whatever you choose to call it, he had inherited and had been brought up under staggering difficulties to represent. The young beggar has made a pot of money in the States, Trawnbey gravely informed me, after Cyril had spent 7 weeks in Pittsburgh, whither he had been persuaded to journey on the Slapp's private train. And you know, I've decided to sell the old place, he casually remarked a month or so later. Yes, he went on, the young people are beginning to leave us. I hadn't noticed any signs of impending flight on the part of Edwina, Violet, and Maud. Mrs. Trawnbey and I want to end our days at home. Slapp believes there's gold on the place. Or would it be petroleum? He's welcome to it. After all, I've never been fearfully keen on business. And I rode away pondering, as I always did, on the great lesson of the Trawnbeighs. That is The Trawnbeighs by Charles M. Flandrau. And I think it's wonderful. This account of an English family on their uppers in exile is supposedly a true story. The location has been changed, but it rings very true. If you know the English in any way at all, it is so English. I mean, that's the spirit that the Germans underestimated rather terribly. To meet as a portrait of sheer Englishness, it takes a lot of beating. I hope you've enjoyed it, my dears. And sooner or later, I'll find out how to get on. As I said, I didn't do anything, and suddenly I was on. Jason, wherever you are, Jason Ellis, I need you. That is Tales and Cocktails for tonight, my dears. And please stay cool. I don't have air conditioning, and thank heaven I have a ceiling fan. But stay cool and hang in there, and do come back next week for another episode of Tales and Cocktails. Love you all. Thank you. See you soon.